The Cavendish Theatre, for all its peeling gilt and whispering curtains, possessed a dignity that only age and a parade of temperamental actors could bestow. Its chandeliers, dimmed for rehearsal, hung like tired stars above the stage where the cast of The Seventh Veil arranged themselves with the languid impatience peculiar to those certain their work deserved better lighting, better management, and, if possible, better colleagues. At 5:30 on a damp October evening, the company had convened for what the producer, Mr. Leonard Fosbury, fondly called the Unity Rehearsal. It was, in truth, a loosely disguised excuse to parade investors through the theatre under the pretext of artistic preview. They sat scattered through the front rows, a murmur of silk cologne and polite, hopeful laughter. Alleyn was not among them, not yet. Scotland Yard had no call at the Cavendish, none that anyone knew of. Instead, the theatre belonged, for the moment, to its own furl of egos and suppressed anxieties. Celia Harbury, the leading lady, stood downstage in the reflective glow of a single working lantern. Her posture was impeccable. One could never fault her training, and yet tension wound itself through every elegant line of her body. She repeated a passage of dialogue with a soft, deliberate articulation that suggested more rehearsal than the script demanded. Celia was not known for uncertainty. Therefore, this over-attentiveness signaled that something or someone had unsettled her. Opposite her lounged Julian Markham, the production's new hire and darling of the tabloids. He held the silver-prop pistol with careless charm, his smile lingering half a beat too long on any woman who glanced his way. It irritated Celia, although she would never say so. Her irritation, as ever, was refined and internal, registered only by a slight narrowing of her eyes when Julian delivered his lines with an affected gravity that had very little to do with the script. Behind the footlights, Leonard Fosbury flitted anxiously. He was a stout little man with a too-bright tie and the permanent expression of someone hoping nobody had noticed the disaster just out of sight. He whispered into the ear of Miss Penelope Grant, assistant stage manager, keeper of schedules and the only person capable of navigating the theatre without making everyone hate her. "Do see that they keep the scene crisp," Fosbury murmured. "Crisp but soft, you understand, Penny dear. It must look effortless." He dabbed his forehead. "Is the gun loaded?" "With blanks, Mr. Fosbury," Miss Grant replied. "Naturally. Quite naturally." His relief was extravagant for such an ordinary assurance. From the shadows at the wings, a different figure watched. Arthur Edgecombe, the veteran actor whose role as the retired colonel had been reduced to brevity by Julian's arrival. He observed the younger man with narrowed, pale eyes. Not openly hostile, but with the contained resentment of someone accustomed to being admired and now finding admiration redistributed. Near him hovered Mrs. Agatha Pond, patron of the arts and self-appointed connoisseur of emerging talent. Her lorgnette, which she used as a conversational weapon, hung from its chain like a guillotine waiting to fall. She surveyed the cast with a benign smile that fooled only newcomers. "That boy," she whispered to Edgecombe, indicating Julian with the slightest tilt of her head. "He has charm. Too aware of it, perhaps." Edgecombe gave a short, dry laugh. "Charm, when undisciplined, becomes a very dull instrument." A quiet chord from the rehearsal pianist signaled Celia and Julian to begin the climactic confrontation. Celia raised her chin, breath steadying. Julian assumed a tragic air so theatrical it caused Fosbury to clutch his tie. "You cannot escape it," Celia murmured, her voice soft but ringing with authority. "The truth follows you, Julian." A flicker of annoyance crossed Julian's features at her use of his real name rather than the character's, but he masked it. He lifted the gun, aiming it with exaggerated dramatic precision. The investors leaned forward. Miss Grant glanced at the gun, then at Celia. Something unreadable passed across her face. Julian pulled the trigger. The blank fired with a sharp crack, louder than expected. Celia flinched almost imperceptibly. The pianist's hands hovered, uncertain. Fosbury emitted a tiny squeak. "Good heavens," Mrs. Pond whispered. "How terribly realistic." Julian grinned. "Only doing my job." Celia's answering smile was thin as tracing paper. Around them, the theater seemed to inhale. Ropes creaked, curtains shifted, distant footsteps echoed along the balconies. A small unease seeped into the edges of the scene. Not fear, nor even tension, but the delicate sense that something in the carefully maintained order had begun, ever so slightly, to tilt. No one would remember afterward exactly who first noticed the smell, the faint, bitter tang in the air, metallic and wrong. But Miss Grant noticed. She stiffened, pressing one hand to her clipboard. Her eyes darted to the gun. Then, composed once more, she stepped forward to reset the scene. If any of them had glanced toward the darkened auditorium door at that moment, they might have seen a tall figure slip quietly inside, pausing at the back with a keen, reflective stillness. Inspector Roderick Alleyn had arrived early. As was his habit when entering foreign territory, he watched before making himself known. And on that dim, fading stage, among actors, patrons, and the glittering facade of artifice, there was already something that pricked at his professional instincts. Something quiet, something out of place, something that would, in due course, demand an answer. The rehearsal broke, as rehearsals often do, not with laughter or applause, but with a murmured confusion that slipped like smoke through the wings. Julian Markham, still holding the silver prop pistol, frowned at the now unsettling emptiness of the stage. Celia Harbury, ever composed, began adjusting the folds of her costume, though her fingers trembled just enough to catch Alleyn's attention from his shadowed vantage point in the back row. It was Miss Grant, the stage manager, who first noticed something amiss. She moved toward Julian, clipboard clutched tightly to her chest, her expression carefully neutral. "The gun. Check it," she said, voice soft but edged. Julian lowered the pistol with a practiced flourish. The blank had fired harmlessly, of course, yet the metallic tang in the air persisted. He sniffed, shrugged lightly, and looked around with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "All perfectly safe, my dear Miss Grant. Perhaps a little theatrical, too realistic for some sensibilities." But Miss Grant's gaze was elsewhere. It rested on the floor, near stage left. Alleyn, having moved forward unnoticed, followed her glance. There, half concealed beneath a velvet curtain, lay Arthur Edgecombe. The veteran actor's posture was unnervingly serene, his hands folded across his chest. His eyes, wide and unseeing, reflected the dim lantern light, still glimmering faintly with a life that had abruptly departed. The silence fell without fanfare. No scream had been heard. No sudden collapse had rippled through the audience of actors and investors. Only the small, inescapable truth: a man was dead. Celia's hands froze on her costume folds. Mrs. Pond drew her lorgnette up in a mechanical gesture, lips pursed in startled decorum. Fosbury flapped both hands, as though signaling some invisible audience not to panic. Miss Grant crouched beside the body, checking a pulse with professional detachment, and found none. Alleyn stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "How long, may I ask, before he was discovered?" Miss Grant's voice was careful. "Merely moments, Inspector, and I suppose everyone assumed he had stepped aside to adjust his costume. I did not notice at first. He must have collapsed while Julian fired the prop." "Prop?" Alleyn's eyes narrowed slightly, though he remained entirely polite. "You refer, of course, to the pistol just discharged." "Yes," Miss Grant replied. "But surely that could not have caused—" She paused, and Alleyn, noting the interruption, inclined his head. No one spoke. The actors looked to one another, as though waiting for someone else to interpret the absurdity of the situation. Julian's grin had vanished. Celia's composure was intact, yet Alleyn saw the faintest twitch of her jaw, a sign of suppressed distress. Alleyn surveyed the body. Edgecombe's features, usually so expressive, were unnaturally relaxed. Nothing about the scene suggested a struggle. The stillness itself was striking, almost theatrical in its calm precision. Alleyn's eyes drifted to the gun. Its metallic surface glinted softly under the lantern light. He did not touch it. Instead, he noted how Julian held it moments before, how he had aimed, how Celia had recoiled. The sequence, innocuous in itself, suddenly felt weighted with unspoken tension. He looked up at the assembled company. Their reactions were varied, but all restrained. Fosbury wrung his hands without raising his voice. Mrs. Pond whispered to no one in particular. Celia's gaze darted briefly to the wings, as if seeking reassurance from a silent confidant. And Julian. Julian's smile had been replaced by a thin line of unease. Alleyn spoke, calm and deliberate. "I must ask that the theatre remain exactly as it is, and that no one leaves the stage until we have clarified the circumstances." Even in that small request, there was authority and restraint. The actors and patrons obeyed instinctively, caught between fear, decorum, and curiosity. In that quiet theatre, with the faint smell of gunpowder still lingering, the first fracture lines beneath the polished surface of the evening began to show. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but for Alleyn, trained as he was to detect the delicate shifts in human composure, the fracture was unmistakable. A murder had occurred, and as always, it was the silence that spoke loudest. Alleyn's thoughts, precise and measured, began to turn over the facts, the timing, the position, the absence of struggle, the reactions. Yet he did not speak further. The room hummed with polite whispers, the faint rustle of silk and satin, and somewhere, just out of sight, the quiet weight of the stage's secrets waited to be discovered. The investigation had begun, not with shouts, nor panic, nor confusion, but with a single, deliberate observation. In this house of appearances, nothing was as it seemed. Inspector Roderick Alleyn moved quietly among the still-gathered actors and patrons, his presence unassuming, yet unmistakably authoritative. He carried no notebook, no badge flashed in the light, only the calm, deliberate air of a man accustomed to reading people before speaking to them. He began at the wings, where the stage curtains fell like darkened water. The velvet folds concealed both secrets and small acts of mischief, and Alleyn's eyes, sharp and patient, traced the faint imprints in the dust along the floorboards. A scuff mark here, a dropped hairpin there. Insignificant, perhaps, to the untrained observer, yet all part of the theatre's living record. From the corner of the stage, he studied the cast. Celia Harbury stood with hands clasped, her expression composed, but her shoulders subtly tensed. Julian Markham lingered near the footlights, fingers drumming lightly against the prop gun. Alleyn noted the careful way Julian avoided meeting Celia's eyes, the slight hesitation in each smile he offered the patrons. Edgecombe's body, now covered with a shawl fetched by Miss Grant, lay undisturbed, and Alleyn allowed his gaze to rest briefly upon it. There was nothing spectacular about the death. No sign of struggle, no contorted agony, but the stillness itself had its own eloquence. He memorized it, catalogued it internally. Death, quiet and precise, had a language all its own, and it was whispered here in the theatre's dim light. Alleyn's attention shifted to the audience of patrons, each a small study in polite reaction. Mrs. Agatha Pond, lorgnette balanced elegantly, leaned against the balcony railing, whispering occasional observations to no one in particular. Her words were deliberately casual, yet her eyes flicked repeatedly toward Julian and Celia, noting subtleties missed by the untrained eye. Fosbury, meanwhile, flitted about the stage like a man caught between panic and pride. Alleyn observed the little man's nervous gestures. The tug of his tie, the constant smoothing of his jacket, the way he glanced toward Miss Grant as if seeking silent absolution for every mismanaged detail. Alleyn did not speak immediately. There was a measured deliberation to his silence, a technique refined through years of observation. Often the first words he spoke carried more weight if he had already seen, with patience, the story unfolding in the behavior of those around him. It was in these small moments, the hesitation of a hand, the flicker of a glance, the rigid posture of a gentleman accustomed to control, that Alleyn gleaned more truth than any spoken confession might reveal. "Miss Grant," he said finally, in his cultivated, unobtrusive voice, "would you be so kind as to recount the precise sequence as you observed it? From the moment Mr. Edgecombe entered the stage to the moment he collapsed." Miss Grant's eyes, attentive yet measured, followed Alleyn's. "Of course, Inspector." Mr. Edgecombe had been standing near the wings, rehearsing his lines quietly, while the others took their positions. Julian was handling the prop gun for the scene. When Celia began the dialogue, her lines as rehearsed, Mr. Edgecombe seemed to adjust his stance. He shifted his weight, then, nothing more. I only noticed something amiss when he did not respond to Celia's final words. By then he had collapsed. Alleyn inclined his head slightly, noting the careful avoidance of certain details. Miss Grant's report was thorough, yet the gaps, the pauses, and the soft evasions spoke louder than the words themselves. He made no immediate comment, simply absorbing, measuring, storing. He turned his gaze toward the stage, where Julian now held the prop gun loosely at his side. "Mr. Markham," Alleyn said, "may I inquire about your handling of the firearm, its condition, its weight, anything unusual you might have observed?" Julian's answer was polite, clipped, and measured. "It is, as always, quite harmless. Blanks only. I assure you, Inspector, nothing about it could have caused this." His voice, though composed, betrayed a faint tremor. Alleyn noted it. Not fear exactly, but a subtle defensiveness. "Indeed," Alleyn murmured. He allowed the conversation to linger there, intentionally unfinished. The subtle interplay of words, tone, and body language, the theater of social masks, was far more revealing than any immediate accusation. The inspector's gaze drifted once more over the assembled company. Each face, each posture, each careful expression was a clue in its own right. And in this world of elegance, civility, and carefully curated appearances, the smallest deviations from the expected pattern were often the most illuminating. Alleyn stepped back slightly, letting the quiet tension of the theater settle around him. In these measured pauses, he was already beginning to discern the delicate fractures beneath the polished surface, and he understood, as always, that the human heart, its pride, its envy, its concealed resentments, would speak where words failed. The theater waited, silent but observant, as Inspector Alleyn's scrutiny quietly took in all that was visible and all that remained hidden. The theater had settled into a peculiar hush, an enforced civility tinged with unease. Patrons lingered in the front rows, whispering behind gloved hands or fans, while the cast drifted to the wings or the dimly lit corridors. Alleyn, moving with his characteristic discretion, began his quiet inquiries, mindful that in such circles the weight of suggestion often proved heavier than accusation. He first approached Celia Harbury, whose poise remained impeccable, though her hands now twisted a silk handkerchief with slight tension. "Miss Harbury," Alleyn said gently, "you were closest to Mr. Edgecombe when the incident occurred. Might you recount what you observed?" Celia's voice was soft, precise, and carefully modulated. "He merely seemed to falter. One instant he stood, the next he leaned. There was no struggle, Inspector, nothing violent. It was sudden, entirely." I could do nothing. Alleyn inclined his head, noting the subtle emphasis she placed on her own helplessness. He filed the observation mentally. In the theatre, as in life, even those who seemed composed could unconsciously reveal fractures in the truth through insistence on propriety. He then turned to Julian Markham, who now hovered near the dressing rooms, avoiding the full gaze of the assembled company. Julian's charm was present but restrained, a deliberate posture of ease that belied the faint tremor in his fingers. "Mr. Markham, you were handling the prop. Did anything at all strike you as unusual about Mr. Edgecombe's manner or the firearm?" Julian shook his head slowly. "Nothing, Inspector. The gun is safe. Blanks only, as always. I assure you, I would never allow—" He stopped, a flicker of irritation, or perhaps defensiveness, passing briefly across his features. "I merely followed the scene as directed." Alleyn made no immediate reply. There was a nuance to Julian's phrasing, a slight over-clarification that suggested the presence of unspoken worry. He filed it alongside the tremor in the hands, the avoidance of Celia's eyes, and the carefully measured pauses in speech. Fosbury, meanwhile, hovered nearby, tugging nervously at his tie and adjusting the crease in his jacket. "Inspector," he said, voice high but polite, "you must understand, this is highly irregular. A man collapsing on stage. It is, well, quite impossible to anticipate. Nothing could have—" He broke off abruptly, glancing toward Miss Grant for reassurance. "Yes, Mr. Fosbury," Alleyn said, courteous but firm. "I am aware. We must, however, be meticulous. Your observations are valuable." Alleyn allowed the small man to settle, then gently led Mrs. Pond aside. The elderly patron of the arts lifted her lorgnette, regarding him with polite curiosity. "Inspector, I confess I rarely encounter such disturbances in our theatres. Yet there is, I feel, something ineffably wrong tonight." "Your sense of wrongness may be acute, Mrs. Pond," Alleyn replied. "Might I ask if you noticed anything unusual in the interactions among the company?" She pursed her lips, allowing a pause pregnant with social decorum. "Only that Mr. Edgecombe seemed slightly withdrawn, more so than I have ever observed. And that boy, Julian, there is a certain, how shall I say, restlessness about him, a tension beneath his charm. One does not notice such things without consequence, Inspector." Alleyn nodded, as though the confirmation of his observations required no further embellishment. He was accumulating a mosaic of small, understated truths: avoidance, hesitation, unspoken rivalries, delicate resentments. Each was a thread, invisible to most, yet vital to the pattern he was quietly discerning. Even the seemingly neutral Miss Grant offered a clue in her subtle evasions. Her careful recounting, her attentiveness to the body, the way she avoided implicating anyone directly, suggested a mind trained to manage both theatre and potential scandal. Alleyn noted her silence as much as her words. In the world of the theatre, as in society at large, what was left unspoken often carried more weight than what was declared aloud. Alleyn moved among them in this deliberate manner, listening, observing, allowing each word and gesture to settle like dust on a carefully tended surface. Politeness, civility, social expectation, all were instruments in his method. And in this restrained theatre of manners, the first true outlines of motive, fear, and concealed resentment were beginning to emerge, quiet as a whisper, but no less telling. The inspector paused near the edge of the stage, allowing the room to breathe, to hum with suppressed tension. Every actor, patron, and staff member carried their own fragment of the story. Alleyn's task was to piece them together, subtly, invisibly, before the next revelation stirred the fragile equilibrium of the evening. Alleyn's attention shifted from the actors and patrons to those who worked quietly behind the scenes. In a house of artifice such as the Cavendish Theatre, The staff often held a different kind of knowledge, less concerned with lines and cues, more attuned to the rhythms of daily life, the subtle patterns of habit, and the discrepancies that might escape the eye of even the most observant director. Miss Grant remained close, ostensibly overseeing the arrangement of props and the draping of curtains. Alleyn allowed her to continue her meticulous work, aware that a stage manager's efficiency often masked the smallest but most telling irregularities. But it was the other figures who caught his attention. The aging stagehand, who had been with the theater long enough to notice a nail out of place, the housekeeper, polishing the railings with practiced detachment, the young usher, whispering quietly with the ticket collector at the far end of the auditorium. Alleyn approached the housekeeper, Mrs. Weatherby, a stout woman with steel-grey hair pinned neatly and eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Weatherby," he said, voice calm and measured. "You have been here for many years. Might I ask if anything unusual has occurred backstage of late?" Mrs. Weatherby's response was careful, deliberate. "Inspector, one does not like to speak of such things lightly. But yes, there have been tensions, small disagreements, misunderstandings, minor irritations. Nothing serious, nothing criminal, one would hope. But one notices when tempers rise where they ought not to." Alleyn inclined his head, noting the phrasing. Her words were general, polite, yet carried the subtle weight of experience. A gentle warning that what seemed ordinary on the surface often concealed sharp edges beneath. He moved to the aging stagehand, Mr. Clavering, whose hands were calloused from years of adjusting curtains, lifting scenery, and maintaining the stage's hidden machinery. "Have you observed anything, however slight, that might have disrupted the evening's rehearsal?" Clavering's response was slower, more deliberate, as though weighing each word against long-held loyalty. "Well, sir, I've seen little things. A hand lingering where it ought not. Eyes meeting in ways that say more than words. Mr. Edgecombe? He's always been a gentleman, yes. But lately—" He paused, searching for a neutral way to speak. "He's not been quite himself. Nothing to accuse anyone of course. Just subtle shifts." Alleyn listened, noting the care with which both servants measured their word. They revealed, while concealing, their discretion was not malice nor fear, but a cultivated awareness that, in this world, knowledge carried consequences. A careless remark could ripple through the theater, damaging reputations, careers, and social standing. It was precisely this discretion that made them invaluable to Alleyn. They held fragments of truth that could be coaxed into clarity, not by force, but by patient, careful observation. He allowed his eyes to linger on the faint smile Mrs. Weatherby gave the young usher, the quick, almost imperceptible exchange of glances between stagehand and assistant. Something unspoken passed between them, small yet deliberate, like a coded signal in a language only they understood. Alleyn turned back to the stage, where the cast remained clustered near the wings, still murmuring in restrained tones. His gaze returned to Miss Grant, who was methodically checking props. He noted the slight tremor of her fingers as she handled the prop pistol again. An almost imperceptible reaction, easily dismissed, yet suggestive of a memory she had not voiced aloud. The inspector made no immediate move to press further. In his experience, servants of this caliber revealed the most when allowed to speak without fear, or when left to the quiet discipline of their routines. Each gesture, each measured word, was a trace, a delicate fingerprint of the night's hidden currents. He took a final glance around the dimly lit wings and corridors. In the theater, as in the world beyond, the people who observed most carefully often spoke least. And yet, it was in these silences that Alleyn found the contours of truth. He would return to them gently at the right moment, knowing that the smallest hint of trust or hesitation might reveal the key to the mysteries unfolding on stage left. The theatre seemed to settle around him, filled with whispers of silk and the faint echo of footsteps. And in that calm, restrained world, Inspector Alleyn understood that knowledge was rarely shouted. It was quietly offered, piece by piece, to those who knew how to look and listen. The theatre, despite its elegant facade, carried the smell of old wood, varnish, and faint perfume, the scent of rehearsals, of whispered lines, of habitual gestures repeated countless times. Alleyn, moving deliberately through the shadows of the wings, found himself observing not only people, but patterns, the subtle choreography of life in a place bound by discipline, etiquette, and performance. Miss Grant returned to her duties, checking the props with meticulous precision. She handled the silver pistol as if it were a fragile relic rather than a stage device. Alleyn watched her hands, noting the small, almost imperceptible way she rotated it, checking its weight and balance. It was a gesture she had repeated countless times before, yet tonight it carried a tension that set it apart. He allowed himself a measured approach. "Miss Grant," he said softly, "you handle these objects daily. Is there any habit or ritual you follow that might differ from the usual?" Miss Grant glanced at him, slightly startled, then gave a faint, controlled smile. "Inspector, one develops certain routines backstage. The placement of props, the care of costumes, even the way one observes the actors. These habits become second nature. Perhaps you refer to something in particular." Alleyn did not answer immediately. Instead, he allowed his eyes to trace the space. The gun, now returned to the prop table, lay at a precise angle. The cue cards rested neatly beside it. Celia's handkerchief was folded exactly as it had been the week before. Yet something was slightly displaced, a chair nudged at an unusual angle, a script left open at a line not yet rehearsed, a faint scuff on the floorboards where the stagehand would never have trodden. "The gun," he said finally, voice low, "was handled moments before Mr. Edgecombe's collapse. Yet I observe the placement here, and there is a faint discrepancy." Miss Grant followed his gaze. "Discrepancy?" "Yes," Alleyn murmured. "A habit, a routine, something repeated for weeks, perhaps months. And now, tonight, it has shifted, just enough to attract attention. Small, almost negligible, yet significant." Her lips pressed together, betraying the first sign of unease. She did not speak, only nodded ever so slightly, as though acknowledging a truth unspoken. Alleyn noted the moment and stored it. In his experience, guilt, fear, or simple inattention often revealed itself not in words, but in the deviation from ritual. He turned his attention to Julian Markham, standing near the footlights, his posture subtly restless. Alleyn's trained eye noticed the way Julian's hand lingered on the gun, the slight hesitation before setting it down. It was a small gesture, habitual perhaps under ordinary circumstances, yet tonight it carried a faint irregularity, as if he were subconsciously compensating for something, or someone. Edgecombe's collapse had disrupted more than the rehearsal. It had disrupted a pattern, a rhythm of behavior the theatre depended upon. Alleyn observed, as always, that such disturbances often revealed far more than the immediate incident. A chair slightly askew, a cue missed by a second, a hand that trembled while adjusting a prop. These were the whispers of hidden tensions, of secrets pressed beneath the polished veneer of civility. As he moved quietly among the wings, he paused before the prop table. The silver pistol gleamed under the dim lantern light. Alleyn did not touch it, but his eyes lingered on a small, almost imperceptible smudge along the handle. A residue out of place. Perhaps overlooked by anyone else, but for a man attuned to the subtle interplay of human action, it suggested hesitation or misplacement or deliberate care. Alleyn straightened, allowing the moment to settle. In theatres, as in life, he reflected, the smallest break in habit often spoke louder than a shout. observing patterns, noting deviations, tracing subtle routines. This was how truth revealed itself in a world bound by manners, appearances, and decorum. The inspector withdrew to the shadows, letting the actors resume their whispered discussions. The evening's unease continued, masked by practiced civility, yet beneath the surface, a silent narrative had begun to take shape. One written in gestures, in habits, in the minute fractures of routine. Alleyn's mind catalogued each anomaly carefully. When the moment came to ask the right questions, he would return to these threads. For now, patience was his instrument, observation his ally, and the theater itself, its routines, rituals, and subtle dislocations, his guide. The subdued tension of the Cavendish Theatre deepened as evening advanced. The actors and patrons remained clustered in hushed groups, each exchanging soft observations or the occasional careful laugh. It was a sound too polite to carry real amusement, and in its place hovered a subtle, shared unease. Inspector Alleyn, having observed the first patterns and deviations, now allowed himself a small, quiet movement among the corridors and dressing rooms, seeking not the loud evidence of a crime, but the faint echoes that only subtlety could reveal. A faint commotion drew him toward the rear of the stage, where Miss Grant had paused by the prop table. She held a folded note, her fingers clutching it with unusual rigidity. Alleyn approached without announcement. "A note, Miss Grant?" he inquired, his voice calm but carrying its usual weight of expectation. "Yes, Inspector," she said, her lips pressed in a thin line. Well, it was slipped beneath my door just before rehearsal. I did not open it, not wishing to intrude improperly." She hesitated, glancing down the dimly lit corridor as though the act of mention itself might summon consequences. Alleyn inclined his head. "May I see it?" She extended it cautiously. The paper was unremarkable at first glance, cream-colored, slightly creased along its edges, the handwriting deliberate and refined. Alleyn studied it with minimal movement, noting the subtle flourishes in the script, the careful spacing, the faint scent of perfume clinging to the ink. It was the handwriting of someone accustomed to control, to attention, to decorum. Yet the contents, a simple, precise line suggesting that someone should heed the consequences of ambition, carried a quiet menace, almost imperceptible but unmistakably present to those sensitive to nuance. Alleyn folded the note slowly and returned it to Miss Grant. "Thank you," he said softly. "Keep it close. It may be significant." From the wings, a different stir arose. Julian Markham, leaning against the edge of the stage, suddenly paled and clutched at his chest, drawing a brief, startled gasp from Celia. No one approached too quickly. Manners and caution restrained even the concerned. After a few moments, Julian straightened, visibly trembling yet masking it beneath the posture of practiced charm. "He's well," Alleyn observed, though he did not offer further reassurance. The tremor had not gone unnoticed. In his experience, subtle physical reactions often betrayed internal conflicts far more convincingly than speech. Meanwhile, Mrs. Pond had retreated to the balcony, where she whispered hurriedly to a companion, her lorgnette lowered in small agitation. Alleyn caught the flicker of her gaze toward the dressing rooms, where Edgecombe's absence now felt strangely palpable beyond the fact of his death. Something else was unsettled, though no one spoke it aloud. A sudden rustle from the prop table brought Alleyn's attention back to the stage. The pistol, now returned to its place, had been nudged slightly from its alignment, less than an inch, but enough to betray that someone had handled it since the first collapse. He observed the soft imprints in the dust and the faint smudge on the polished handle. Minor, almost imperceptible. Yet, in the careful logic of theater habits, it was a deviation worth noting. The theater itself seemed to hold its breath. The soft tap of distant footsteps, the faint creak of floorboards, the whisper of a curtain swaying slightly. Alleyn catalogued each sound, each movement, storing them for the precise moment when observation would transform into insight. Something more, subtle yet insistent, had shifted in the room's equilibrium. Not a scream, not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet disturbance. A second note, a tremor of the hand, a deviation in routine. Each spoke in a language of nuance, signaling that the first death had been neither isolated nor entirely explicable by accident. Alleyn allowed himself to remain unobtrusive. The company's polite murmurs, the careful steps of the staff, the faint anxieties revealed in gestures and postures, all were pieces of a puzzle he was assembling. Patience, as always, was essential. Abrupt questioning, loud confrontation, or visible anxiety would scatter these fragments before they revealed their subtle connections. And so the theater continued, a vessel of elegance and quiet dread. Somewhere beneath its surface, tension was gathering, not as a storm, not as a spectacle, but as a delicate, almost imperceptible fracture in the pattern of human behavior. Alleyn observed it patiently, knowing that in time the quietest stirrings often yielded the most decisive truths. By the time the theater had emptied of all but the essential staff, a hush more profound than any earlier tension had descended. Alleyn remained, standing in the wings, where the faint amber light of the lanterns pooled across the polished boards. In the quiet, he allowed himself the luxury of thought, assembling in his mind the subtle patterns of the evening, the delicate fractures among actors, staff, and patrons alike. He had observed more than words could tell. Celia Harbury's flawless composure, tinged with the merest undercurrent of unease. Julian Markham's charm, tempered by an almost imperceptible tremor. Fosbury's fussy insistence on propriety. Mrs. Pond's delicate but probing scrutiny. Miss Grant's meticulous routines, now disrupted ever so slightly. Each had left a trace, not loud or dramatic, but precise and telling. Alleyn's eyes drifted to the prop table. The pistol lay exactly where it had been placed after the rehearsal, yet the faint smudge on the handle remained, almost imperceptible under the dim glow. Such small deviations, habitual yet shifted, often carried the most information. Here, in the theater's quiet aftermath, Alleyn could trace intent in gestures, subtle hesitation in repeated motions, and the faint echoes of human emotion in what had been left untouched. He recalled the note, perfumed, deliberate, and ominously restrained. Someone had taken care to warn, to suggest consequences without naming cause. The style and subtle insistence of its phrasing implied knowledge of both stagecraft and human psychology. Alleyn's intuition told him it was not an idle prank. It had been placed with thought, timing, and expectation. His thoughts turned, inevitably, to Edgecombe. The veteran actor's collapse had been sudden, precise, almost ceremonial in its stillness. Alleyn considered the timing, the sequence of cues, the gestures and postures of those present. Nothing suggested violence in the ordinary sense. Yet in the theater of subtle observation, where every movement is weighted and every hesitation meaningful, Alleyn sensed a pressure, social, emotional, psychological, that had accumulated until the moment of release. He walked slowly among the stage props, noting the slight disarray, a chair nudged slightly forward, scripts lying open at lines not yet rehearsed, a faint indentation in the floor where someone had lingered too long. Each anomaly, minor in isolation, coalesced in Alleyn's mind into a quiet, insistent narrative. It was not one of force or spectacle, but of intent layered beneath propriety. Alleyn paused, letting his gaze drift over the empty auditorium. The upholstered seats, the faint scent of polish and perfume, the soft rustle of the curtains. They were all witnesses to a drama more subtle than any enacted on stage. In such an environment, The human psyche revealed itself in small, almost imperceptible ways. The fleeting glance, the slight tremor of a hand, the carefully measured evasions of speech. He considered the company, each person's probable thoughts, desires, and unspoken resentments. Patterns of habit had been disrupted, rituals broken, notes slipped surreptitiously into hands. Tremors betrayed anxiety. In his experience, motive need not roar. It often whispered, barely audible to those untrained to listen. Alleyn's intuition settled like dust over the stage. It was not yet time to confront, nor even to question further. First, one must allow the patterns to reveal themselves fully. The quiet moments, the hesitations, the divergences from habitual behavior, they would in time guide him. The theater, the people within it, and the invisible currents that governed their interactions all formed the threads of a web. Alleyn simply had to wait for them to align. Outside the wings, the lanterns flickered softly. The room was still, though the air felt charged with expectation, the faintest tension persisting in the spaces between silence. Alleyn understood that the truth, like a delicate stage mechanism, revealed itself not by force but by the subtle movements of its components. And he, patient and observant, would see it in due course, when the slightest motion drew the final curtain. For now, the theater exhaled, and Alleyn, like a careful scholar of human nature, continued to watch and wait. The following morning brought with it a fragile calm. The theater, bathed in soft daylight through tall, dusty windows, seemed almost ordinary once more. Yet for those who knew how to observe, the traces of the previous evening lingered like shadows cast upon the walls. The slight misalignment of props, the faint scent of perfume in corners, the careful avoidance of certain gazes. Alleyn moved quietly through the corridors, aware that the air was now thick with the weight of unspoken truths. He had spent the night reviewing every detail in his mind, gestures, hesitations, deviations from routine. The subtle fractures of the evening had coalesced in his awareness, forming a pattern that, while not yet complete, offered him a degree of clarity no one else possessed. Alleyn chose a discreet approach. He asked Miss Grant to fetch Julian Markham under the pretense of discussing rehearsal schedules. The young actor appeared in the wings, still carefully composed, though the faint tremor in his hand betrayed restless nights. "Mr. Markham," Alleyn began, his voice low and measured, "may we speak privately?" Julian nodded, leading the way to a small side office where sunlight filtered through thin curtains. The room was sparsely furnished, a writing desk, a set of chairs, and a narrow bookcase whose volumes smelled faintly of dust and leather. It was an environment in which even the slightest action or gesture could be observed in detail. Alleyn seated himself, leaving Julian standing, a subtle assertion of calm authority. "I've been reviewing the events of last evening," he said, "observing habits, gestures, and interactions. It is remarkable how much can be inferred without a single, loud declaration." Julian's hands twitched briefly at his sides. "Inspector, I assure you, Alleyn held up a hand. "You need not speak immediately. In fact, it is often better to remain silent while I am speaking, for words can conceal or reveal far more than intended." He paused, letting the statement settle. "I've noticed small inconsistencies, deviations from usual routines, gestures that betray hesitation, actions performed almost mechanically but not quite as expected. Minor to the untrained eye, yet telling." Julian's posture stiffened. He attempted a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I am not sure I follow, Inspector. You mean—" "I refer," Alleyn continued softly, "to the subtle indications of intent and unease. Your handling of the prop, the tremor observed during rehearsal, the faint alterations in routine, all speak of pressure, anticipation, or knowledge." He allowed the words to linger. Julian swallowed. I do not know what you mean. It was merely a rehearsal, as rehearsals always are. Alleyn inclined his head, observing the imperceptible tightening of the young man's shoulders, the careful avoidance of eye contact. Perhaps. Yet a rehearsal is also a stage for truths to appear, if one knows how to watch. And you, Mr. Markham, have acted in ways last night that are consistent with knowledge of circumstances beyond the ordinary scope of rehearsal. Julian's mouth opened and closed, searching for a response, yet none came. He was polite, restrained, yet the tension radiating from him was unmistakable. Alleyn did not press further, allowing the silence to speak. Later, Alleyn returned to the main stage, where the company had resumed quiet work, conversations carefully limited to neutral topics. The effect of his private interrogation had not been immediate, but subtle. Julian moved with slightly more self-conscious care. Celia maintained her composure with a trace of wary alertness, and even Fosbury's fussing had become tempered with caution. Alleyn, standing in the wings and observing this renewed equilibrium, noted that the theatre now operated under a delicate, almost fragile calm. Nothing had been announced. No accusations had been made. And yet, within that calm, each person's behavior had shifted imperceptibly, as if the knowledge of scrutiny had caused the first ripple of unease to settle across the room. He understood the moment for confrontation or revelation had not yet arrived. For now, the equilibrium, tenuous, delicate, and full of unspoken anxiety, would persist. In the quiet, in the observant stillness, the threads of truth were aligning. Alleyn allowed himself a brief moment of reflection, watching gestures, noting pauses, and cataloguing small adjustments in posture and expression. The theatre was alive, yet subdued. The players were conscious of their own masks, and those masks, he knew, would soon reveal more than words ever could. Patience, he reminded himself, was as necessary as observation. And in that patient silence, Alleyn's understanding settled further, ready for the moment when the final truth would emerge. Not with spectacle, but with quiet inevitability. By late afternoon, the theatre seemed almost ordinary once more, though an observer like Alleyn knew that appearances were deceptive. The rehearsal room smelled faintly of ink and varnish. The chairs and props lay in familiar arrangements. Yet beneath the surface, the tension that had gathered overnight lingered like a thin, invisible mist. Alleyn had spent hours cataloguing gestures, pauses, hesitations, and the slight deviations from habitual routines. Now the time had come to allow observation to give way to revelation. He gathered the company quietly in the rehearsal room, a space of muted light and polished floors. There were no announcements, no public declarations. The actors and staff complied, instinctively aware that when Alleyn spoke, his words carried the authority of subtle inevitability. The inspector waited a moment, allowing the room to settle into attentive silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice measured, courteous, yet imbued with unmistakable precision. The events of last evening were unusual, to say the least. A gentleman has died, and it is our duty to understand why. I will not speak of evidence in dramatic terms. Instead, I will ask you to reflect quietly on your own actions as I recount what has been observed. He paused, scanning the room. Each gaze met his with polite attention, each posture carefully neutral, yet Alleyn discerned the subtle shifts. A hand that lingered near the prop pistol, a shoulder tightening at the mention of routine, a glance toward a corner where a note had been found. "It is remarkable," he continued, "how much a single deviation from habit can reveal. Minor gestures, repeated routines altered by a moment of calculation or hesitation, serve as signposts. In the course of last night's rehearsal, these signposts led me to one individual whose conduct was consistently inconsistent with innocence." A faint murmur rippled through the group, carefully restrained. Alleyn's eyes rested on Julian Markham, The young actor's posture stiffened, his hands gripping the edge of the nearest chair. Alleyn's observation was quiet, unyielding, precise. "Mr. Markham," Alleyn said softly, "your handling of the prop, your subtle hesitation, the tremor noted when responding to the unexpected collapse of Mr. Edgecombe, these were not accidental. They corresponded with knowledge of the circumstances leading to the tragedy that occurred stage left." Julian swallowed, attempting a composed nod, yet his voice trembled slightly. "Inspector, Alleyn raised a hand, not as a demand for silence, but as a measure of restraint. "There is no need for a dramatic confession. Your actions, your gestures, and the disruption of familiar routines have spoken clearly enough. It is not through shouting or spectacle that the truth has been revealed, but through the quiet language of observation and habit." Celia's eyes widened imperceptibly, though she said nothing. Mrs. Pond adjusted her lorgnette with a faint, thoughtful frown. Fosbury muttered under his breath, as if acknowledging that the theatre's decorum had been pierced not by force, but by the subtle currents of human character. Alleyn allowed the silence to settle. Julian's own recognition of the inevitability of exposure was evident in the slight droop of his shoulders, the careful lowering of his gaze. There was no theatrical collapse, no dramatic confession shouted to the rafters. Instead, there was acceptance, quiet, inevitable, and deeply uncomfortable. "Justice," Alleyn said finally, "is often not a matter of spectacle. It is quiet, precise, and unavoidable once the truth is discerned. You will be held accountable, of course. Yet the subtlety of human actions, the faint tremors and hesitations, have already rendered the narrative clear." Julian nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging the invisible chains of consequence. There was no dramatic defiance, only the measured resignation of a man confronted by the inevitability of observation. Alleyn stepped back, allowing the room to breathe. The theatre, still bathed in soft light, seemed to exhale with the company. The actors returned to their routines, subdued, aware of the invisible scrutiny that had brought clarity without spectacle. The quiet had spoken louder than any raised voice could have, and in the calm, deliberate manner that defined his method, Inspector Alleyn had drawn the hidden threads together, exposing truth with elegance, restraint, and precision. And as always, the room itself seemed to acknowledge the resolution, not with celebration, but with the quiet, almost imperceptible shift of human behavior returning to its habitual rhythm, now slightly altered by knowledge. The day had waned, leaving the theatre bathed in the soft gold of late afternoon. Shadows stretched across the polished floors, and the air carried the faint aroma of varnish, ink, and lingering perfume. The theatre returned to its usual rhythm, yet subtly altered by the events of the past 24 hours. Inspector Alleyn remained quietly observant, allowing the actors and staff to move about their work, noting the precise ways in which comportment had shifted under the weight of last night's revelations. Julian Markham had been discreetly escorted to a side room by the authorities, accompanied by a polite but firm notice that he would face the consequences of his actions. No dramatic handcuffs had been applied. No outraged cries had echoed through the wings. Even in enforcement, the theatre's elegance dictated restraint. Julian's face was pale, composed only to the degree that he could maintain social grace. Yet Alleyn noted the subtle trembling in his hands and the careful avoidance of his fellow actors' gazes, a silent acknowledgement that the world of civility still imposed accountability. Celia Harbury resumed her rehearsal quietly, her voice precise and steady, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed lingering unease. She moved with an elegance born of habit, yet Alleyn discerned the small, cautious glances she cast toward the now empty stage left, as if measuring the absence of both the victim and the culprit in tandem. Fosbury busied himself with the arrangement of props and schedules, muttering softly to Miss E. Grant, whose own meticulous routines had resumed. Even Mrs. Pond, ever the critic and observer, allowed her lorgnette to rest, content to witness the restoration of order without overt commentary. In the theatre's restored equilibrium, subtle lessons had been impressed upon all. Actions, no matter how carefully disguised, left traces, and masks eventually slipped under careful scrutiny. Alleyn stood alone for a moment near the wings, absorbing the quiet. The theatre had returned to a semblance of normalcy, yet the psychological contours of the evening remained altered. Small, almost invisible lines had been drawn between actors, patrons and staff. Small, almost imperceptible truths had entered the air alongside routine rehearsals and polite conversation. It was a justice measured not by spectacle, but by inevitability. Julian would answer to the authorities. The theatre would continue its performances, yet the consequences of human behavior had already rippled through every corner of the house. Some fractures would heal, others would remain, faintly visible to those attentive enough to notice. Alleyn allowed himself a quiet reflection. In his experience, the theatre, much like society itself, demanded civility, restraint, and decorum even as it concealed the darker currents beneath. Justice, when administered subtly, often worked in parallel with irony. A man's own habits, impulses, and decisions were as effective in revealing truth as any formal investigation. He observed the empty stage. The prop pistol returned to its place, the chairs aligned, the scripts resting at familiar lines. The elegance of the theatre remained, yet it bore the quiet imprint of human error, ambition, and miscalculation. Alleyn knew, as he often did, that no shouting or dramatics were necessary to deliver moral consequence. Life itself, with its routines and rituals, had already imposed it. And so, the theatre's day continued. Performance, rehearsal, and social grace persisted, yet beneath the surface, every subtle gesture, glance, and hesitation carried memory of the night's quiet tragedy. A reminder that human behavior, once observed, rarely lies, and that justice often unfolds softly alongside the ordinary cadences of life. Alleyn lingered only briefly, his presence almost imperceptible. He had seen, discerned, and allowed events to take their inevitable course. The machinery of civility would continue to turn, carrying both consequence and quiet irony along with it, leaving the theatre and its inhabitants forever altered, though outwardly unchanged. The evening had drawn down to a quiet hush, and the Cavendish Theatre seemed to breathe in measured rhythm, as though exhaling the tension of the past day. The actors had returned to their dressing rooms, Miss Grant to her meticulous oversight of props, and the stage stood empty, its polished boards reflecting the faint amber glow of lanterns still left alight for safety. Alleyn lingered in the wings, alone, absorbing the subtle aftershocks of the events he had quietly unraveled. He allowed himself a moment to observe. The theatre, outwardly restored to its customary order, bore the invisible marks of human behavior. Slight shifts in posture, the occasional hesitation in movement, the careful avoidance of certain glances. Even the prop pistol rested with a faint smudge, a silent testament to last night's disturbance, unnoticed by anyone but those trained to see. Alleyn considered the inevitability of what had transpired. A life lost, motives revealed, the culprit accounted for, not through dramatic confrontation, not by raised voices, but by the steady accumulation of observation, attention, and intuition. The truth, he reflected, rarely demanded theatrics. It made itself known in the subtle deviations of habit, the tremors of conscience, and the quiet weight of circumstance. He thought of Edgecombe, fallen stage left, and of Julian Markham, now bound to accountability by both law and the inescapable scrutiny of character. He considered Celia Harbury, Fosbury, Mrs. Pond, Miss Grant, and the silent, knowing staff. Their behaviors and reactions marked not only by civility, but by the faint traces of human emotion left unspoken. In each case, Alleyn had observed, catalogued and understood. The theatre, he mused, was like society itself, elegant, structured, polite, and yet susceptible to fracture beneath its polished surface. Deception was subtle. Crime, in its quietest forms, left no dramatic residue but a series of small, telling signs, and patience, as always, was the most potent instrument of detection. Alleyn stepped lightly onto the empty stage, his footsteps echoing faintly. The boards had borne countless actors, countless performances, countless rehearsals. Tonight, they had borne something else. Human error, ambition, misjudgment, and the subtle, inexorable truth that emerges from observation and reflection. He paused, gazing at the shadows cast by the lantern light. For a moment, he allowed himself a private acknowledgement that justice, civility, and human complexity coexisted in fragile harmony, yet required careful attention to discern the lines along which consequence would inevitably travel. And with that, he withdrew to the wings, leaving the theatre to its evening stillness. The room was quiet, orderly, unchanged in outward appearance, yet forever marked by the subtle truths it had silently witnessed. Alleyn, as ever, understood that in such worlds, the greatest revelations are not shouted but quietly observed, noted and remembered. A single curtain swayed slightly in the breeze from an open window, and he allowed himself a faint smile at the poetry of it. Life, manners, and mystery, intertwined, persistent, and quietly insistent. Inspector Alleyn turned to leave, his mind cataloguing the patterns, gestures, and subtleties of the day, aware that while the theatre's calm would endure, the human stories beneath it would continue, quietly, inevitably, in the delicate dance of observation and understanding. The shadows lengthened. The stage waited, and in the hush of the Cavendish Theatre, the final truth rested, delivered not with spectacle, but with the elegance of restraint.